Good afternoon or good morning, or good evening, depending on where you are located. I'm happy to join you today from Purdue University, where we have the pleasure today to host Lee Metcalf. Lee has 30 years of experience in STEM, with her primary expertise being in mathematics and cybersecurity. She does hold a PhD in algebraic topology. She spent many years working in tech companies, including startups and established businesses, and is currently a cybersecurity researcher at an FFRDC located at Carnegie Mellon University. Additionally, she's an author of 2 best-selling cybersecurity books and is currently co-editor-in-chief of a new academic journal, the ACM Digital Threats Research and Practice. Lee, welcome to Purdue.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here. I'm going to talk today about the gauntlet of cybersecurity research. In other words, using security and cybersecurity research. The goal of, when we say that's not using security, it's using science and cybersecurity research. The goal in using science and cybersecurity research is not to sit back and use the scientific method that we all learned in 8th grade. It is rather to do cybersecurity well. So this talk is not aimed at just researchers. It's aimed at anyone in cybersecurity who wants to figure things out, because that's the heart of cybersecurity. Who did this? Why did they do it? How can I stop it from happening again? What happens if I enact this policy? What happens if I block people from attacking me on this port? Everything in cybersecurity in its heart is figuring these things out. So we all want to, my computer's is jumping. We want to do a good job figuring it out, but we need a good foundation for doing that. That's knowing what to do and knowing what not to do. So to begin with, we're going to collect some data to do a study. We do this even if we're just handling an incident, right? You have an incident, someone reports to you that something happened on this system, so you have to go to that system and collect some data. You do that in a measured fashion that we call structured observation. In a structured observation, it's also common in science that an ecologist, for example, is a nice little science example, is going to measure the number of moths that show up in a trap. Do they do this by just wandering through the fields and saying 1 moth, 2 moths, 3 moths? Do they just throw moth traps all over the place and hope the heck it works? No. They figure out locations, similar locations with similar ecologies, like they always put it in forests or they always put it in swamps. They go measure at the same time every day, and they use the same kind of trap. And if there's any deviation from this, they note that down so that they know in the future, hey, this is why this might look a little different. Cybersecurity data should be collected in a similar fashion. Here's an example using network flow and network traffic. Network traffic monitoring is different if you put the sensor outside the firewall or inside the firewall. If you put it inside the firewall, you don't see all those attempts made to connect to the part that are blocked by the firewall. But if it's outside, you do. And so if you're collecting network traffic data and you have 2 sensors in 2 different locations, you're not doing this in a structured way. You need to have them similarly set up. So collecting data requires a plan. You have to have a plan of what you're doing. You just don't, for example, when you're handling an incident, you just don't wander around and go, I think I'll look at random systems and see what happened. You know, you have a system of what you do, a checklist even. You also need to not affect the events yourself. And the plan should be followed exactly with no deviations. If for some reason you have to modify the plan, like, hey, the sensor that we were using to collect network traffic died for 6 hours on Tuesday, you need to write that down so that you know in the future what happened. And the plan should be usable by everyone. It's not the Lee plan, it's not the Joel plan, it's that everyone can use this plan. And once you have the data, you've done all your work, you've structured observation, you've collected the data, now you need to construct your study. And there's more than one kind of research study available. So way back when I learned about the scientific method, we were essentially told this is the only way to do it. Well, it's not exactly true. So on the following slides, we'll go through some different study types and give some examples of what each one is. For example, we start with natural experiments and measurement studies. That's where you're observing the state of the world and some change happens. For example, when GDPR rights were enacted, a major study was done by MOG, which is the working group on malware, mobile, and messaging, to determine how did the GDPR rights and change how they were able to collect data affecting these events. Measuring cybercrime before and after a law is enacted. Similarly, if you have you're enacting a new policy, you want to know how does it change things with enacting that new policy. You don't just say, okay, after the policy, this is what happened. You need to know what happened before the policy in order to compare it to what after the policy to say, hey, these changes affected things. Another one is a case study. It's a single report, like a malware. You're studying a single malware. You're studying a vulnerability. A variation of this is called a longitudinal case study, where you're studying the malware over time. For example, I've been studying malicious Word documents over time. How did they change from my first set of data from 4 years ago to what's happening now with these? Are they all still using the same methods? Have they changed how they're doing it? And I'm putting together a report that tells you that people be malicious and things aren't changing that much. Another one is an intervention, and this is commonly happening in incident response. So I've been the victim of a DDoS. I've been a victim of a DOS. I've been woken up at 2 a.m. because I was in industry, because one of our customers got hit with a denial of service. They wanted me to do something about it. So I did an intervention. I blocked the IP address it was coming from. Luckily at the time, this was before DDoS was a major thing, and I could do that. But I also was able to say, hey, after I booted the intervention, the DOS stopped and I can go back to sleep now, and that's a good thing. Clifford Stoll's book, The Cuckoo's Egg, is a prime example of an intervention study. A randomized control trial is what we often see in medicine. We have a group of people we want to try a new vaccine on, so we don't try it on everyone, we try it on a subset, and then we have a control group that we don't try it on. This was seen in a lot of the COVID studies for these new vaccines. This also happens in cybersecurity. This happens when we canary software releases. So if we have a whole bunch of systems and we need to update software, we might do it on a control set, a set of those. We leave a control set as everyone else to see how the change affected. Some user studies in cybersecurity also do the same thing. And finally, one that's near and dear to my heart is mathematical exploration. Rather than releasing the piece of malware on the world and seeing what would happen, because that's very bad to do, we instead create a model of how this could happen and look at what happens. This was done to watch and see how worms spread. And also it's all fuzzing. Fuzzing is a simulation or a mathematical exploration. And CERT has done fuzzing. So now that we know what the 5 types are in general, let's talk about the results. The results are important, but what's also important is how these results can be used by other people. So there's reproducibility, replicability, and they're 2 completely different things. They also have a friend named corroboration. But reproducibility and replicability also often get tossed together, and people to understand there's an actual difference in what you do with the results. Reproducible means I can take data from the study and compute the same outcomes. Replicability means I can take the method. So reproducible is the data and replicable is the method to get the same corroboration conclusions. Corroboration means someone else did a different study and got the same results. For example, several years ago, actually a lot of years ago, a coworker and I released a 300-page report on blacklists. Yes, 300 pages on how they didn't actually always agree. That blacklists were looking at different things, or even if they were looking at the same things, they were catching different things. I was told that a person went to a conference with a presentation that began with, I looked at their report. I decided they were completely and absolutely wrong, so I was going to redo it with my own data and methods and see what I got. His end result was, you know what? They were right. Blacklists don't agree. We want our research to be used, right? I wanted the fact that I found blacklists to be disjoint to be used. And I want it to be applicable. But if my research can't be repeated or reproduced or corroborated, it is less useful. It doesn't mean it's not useful at all. It just means that people can't replicate what I was doing. Now, I've run into malware researchers who inform me that if you look at any other type of malware than the one they're using, then of course I can't be repeating it or reproducing it, which is probably true. But if I'm looking at the same kind of malware, I should be able to. So far, I've done the goals of research, the kind of study, how to collect data, about the results. These are important things, but also important are pitfalls. What can you do to keep your research useful and applicable? This isn't everything. That's actually covered in my second book in a more depth and hopefully in my third book. But I hope it's a good introduction on what you need to avoid when doing cybersecurity research. I'm going to start with visualizations. Now, I'm quoting a coworker of mine who told me, she was a statistician, that a visualization is a model for the eyes. We can generate these in huge machine learning models and everything, or we can just make a picture and let the eyes go, hey, there's the anomaly right there in that corner. That shouldn't be there. It's letting my brain be the analytic engine rather than writing a huge machine learning thing. A bad visualization, though, can hinder this. It can obfuscate the story. It can hide trends. It can highlight the wrong thing. It can be hard to understand. So when you start with a visualization, and there are entire books written on this topic. These are just things that I think are important. You need to start by considering, why am I making this picture? Remember, a picture is worth 1,000 words, okay? It tells a story. What story am I trying to tell? What do I want the people looking at it to take away from it? Is the visualization necessary? We get papers into DTRAP where quite often we go back to the authors and say, why did you add these visualizations? They're not telling me anything. We want to help you tell the story. We don't want you to distract from the story. Am I trying to show something that's actionable? Do I want them to look at the picture and go, there's the anomaly. I should do something with that anomaly and go off and do something? Or am I just trying to illustrate, to explain a point? So here's my first picture. This picture is important to me because I have seen an animated version of this picture, and I still don't know what I was supposed to take away from the animated version of the picture. So first of all, is this a static point in time? Is it a snapshot of that animated picture? Okay, in that case, that's kind of interesting. Or is it over the last hour of the animation? Is it cumulative for a day? That doesn't really tell me anything in the highlights, but I'm going to assume it's cumulative for, say, an hour or so. And it tells the viewer IP addresses talk to ports. It's very important. It also tells me that it looks like there was some scanning possibly going on. There was one IP address that looked like it got completely scanned from top to bottom, and then there's one that got scanned from ports 32,000 and up or so. But does it tell me anything I can go off and do with it? Well, it's a pretty picture. I'll give it that. It's a nice purple color. If the point of my picture is IP addresses talk to ports during the day or during the hour, or there's some scanning that happens, and guess what? This is a decent picture. This is a good visualization. I can take that away from it. But if the point of this is, here is actionable data, this isn't a good visualization. For one thing, I have no idea what IP addresses I'm supposed to care about. There's some I should care about, I'm sure. But what if one of those is a web server that's suddenly talking on things it shouldn't be talking on? How do I know that? It's lost in that noise. And I also like to point this picture out and say, okay, if someone says, find the anomalies, here's a lovely picture, find the anomalies. Because like I said, originally visualizations can be using your eyes for the model, and your eyes can say, here's the anomalies in this picture. So when I say, here are the anomalies, what would you say? Well, you'd say there's some scanning. then that's all I got. If someone else has anything else they can tell me that's there, that's great, but I don't see anything other than, here's a lovely picture of IPs and ports talking to each other. I've also made a visualization of ports talking to ports. It doesn't tell me anything either. And if the point of this visualization is, hey, there's some scanning, then adding some color can help. That does highlight there's some scanning, but it also doesn't tell me there's anything actionable. I'm telling the story that there is scanning, but I'm not giving anything actionable. There's nothing really actionable in this picture. Now, on the other hand, if I made a completely new visualization, and like I did in this picture, and I threw in some IP addresses, then hey, guess what? This is potentially actionable. That IP address 127.10.163.113, that sucker's being scanned or was scanned. 127.10.231.15 was scanned from ports 32,000 and up. That's also something I should know. So this additional information of the IP addresses makes this a little more actionable. But if there wasn't any scanning, then it'd also be a nice, pretty picture with some nice purple and red, which is not exactly great visualization, but there's some colors. Always be careful with your colors. Here's my next example, and this one is also to make a separate point. So a gadget in software is an entry point that can potentially be exploited. Doesn't mean it can be exploited, it just means it can potentially be exploited. Now, not every gadget can be exploited at all. And so by me counting these, when I'm saying that all the gadgets are actually equal, they're all the same, I equate this to saying, okay, all the holes in a dam are exactly the same weight. That little tiny drop of a hole in the corner is the same weight as the giant gaping hole in the center. Not really, no, but this is a common problem when doing frequencies, because when you count like this, you're making everything in the set equal weight. You're saying everything is the same. I have 10 gadgets, therefore it implies that there's 10 similar things going on. There are in the fact that they are all gadgets, they are not, and they don't have the same meaning. If we count and visualize the number of vulnerabilities, the same thing happens. We're giving every vulnerability have the same meaning. Now, it depends on what story you're trying to tell. If you're trying to say the Linux kernel has 200 vulnerabilities as of today and this year, and I don't know if that's true or not, I just made that up, then that's one thing to say. If you're saying all 200 vulnerabilities are the equal exploitable and equally scary, that's not the same thing. So I redid the visualization. I said, okay, software 0 has all these gadgets, but none of them are exploitable. Software 1 has some that are exploitable. So I made a histogram and I have changed the story a little bit. Now, of course, this doesn't mean when I say they're exploitable, this doesn't mean they're equally easy to exploit. That means that someone could exploit them potentially. One of them may take a month of coding. One of them may take 2 minutes, depending on your ability to code. It's still saying the same weight, but I'm also explaining to people that not every gadget can be exploited. So this is the story I'm trying to tell. The message I'm trying to give with this visualization. And the second point is, hey, not every software gadget is exploitable. Some are, some aren't. Some software has gadgets, but none of them are exploitable. Always think of your audience when you're making a visualization. If you're writing a paper, if you're putting together a PowerPoint, what story are you trying to tell? Are you trying? It's too easy to make a visualization that will obfuscate the point you're trying to make. This isn't also one that's near and dear to my heart because I'm looking at malicious domains. I have a set of malicious domains. I believe I collected this one from the malware domain list. And I just went through and got the first letter of every fully qualified domain name, and I plotted it out as a histogram. That's sort of like going into the dictionary, picking a whole bunch of random words and doing the same thing. That's nothing that's unique to domains. That's just an interesting little feature that happens in the alphabet. And I could do it with any set of words, and I wouldn't really be telling you anything about domains at all, would I? just that, hey, they all start with this, and fully qualified domain names often start with a W, and which kind of makes sense because www dot whatever, but so what? I got nothing. It's a pretty thing. But this is a feature of domains. They have a TLD, and I can go through and look at the most common TLD. And this is potentially interesting because TLD is a common feature to domains that I could potentially use. Now, the fact that most of these domains were in COM isn't that necessarily interesting because COM is actually the largest TLD of all. I haven't counted the number of domains in there in a while, but it's pretty big. On the other hand, name is in there. Name is the second highest, and name is actually kind of small. And it also is interesting is how many are showing up in brand new TLDs. You can actually get the brand new TLDs fully domain zone files. That's actually part of them registering it, is I can look at them and say, hey, how many of these are malicious? I did a study with a coworker, and we found that in, for example, the .tv, which is the country code for Tuvalu, I believe, with the exception of a few TV stations, there's a whole lot of maliciousness in there. So now that I've gone through my pet peeve on visualizations, I'm going to do an example of research. I firmly believe you can learn as much from good examples and bad examples. So I'm putting together essentially a bad example of research. I want you to remember that this is a bad example and don't do these things. I also made this up. I completely made this up. I didn't do any research at all. It's all made up. I just want to reiterate, I made this up. So I'm starting with a theory. And I often start with kind of theories like this. I may have just looked at some data and said, hey, wait a minute. This IP has been bad over the past 6 months, and every month it gets more and more malicious domains pointed to it. Huh, I wonder why. And then I say, hey, I wonder if that's true for all the malicious domain, IP addresses, excuse me. Are they gradually, as longer that they stay malicious, the bad guys use it more and more often? Is that true? Well, I think it's true. And I'm going to prove it's true. So what do I need? I need an IP list, a list of malicious IP addresses. I tend to collect this kind of stuff. And so I have a set. I have many sets. I need passive DNS, so it'll let me look up what domains point to those IP addresses. And I need a collection schedule. Is there anything else I need? I mean, I need the standard computers in order to collect all this data, but this is basically the kind of data I need to make this thing happen. So I'm going to collect the data on the first of every month for the previous month. So what I used to do is collect passive DNS for a month and then go through and look at it after that month. So during that month, I might see for this IP address, on the first of the month, it had 5 domains, and then it added more and more domains to the end of the month. And at the end of the month, there were some total of 20 domains that pointed to that IP address during the month. So I count that. I'm not interested in pointer lookups because pointer lookups really require ownership of the IP address to work. Malicious bad guys don't always own their IP addresses. So I'm looking at A records because anyone can make an A record to point to anywhere. So I'm starting with some basic counting, some basic exploratory data analysis, and I make a picture so I can look at it. And I averaged the number of domains per IP address and created this histogram. It's just a basic histogram. Hey, on month 1, almost 6 IPs, almost 6 domains per IP. And by the end, about 12. Okay. But I noticed something. I'm interested in how the data changes from month to month. Month 1 and month 2 have the same average. That really isn't helping my case. I'm saying things change, and the fact that they didn't doesn't help me anything. So I'm just going to drop month 1 because of that. I'm not going to do my study on 3 months instead of 4. And then I look at the distribution for month 2 in general, just plot out how many domains point to each IP address, do some counting, and I have a nice pretty picture. So I really am interested in IP addresses that have domains, not those without domains. Those without domains are not adding anything to my story. My story is that IP addresses have domains. So I see a lot of those in that month. And I'm just going to drop them from my study. I mean, they're not adding anything to my study. There's 140 some odd. Just drop them, not have anything to do with it. And I redo everything, right? Look at this. I have a nice, pretty picture. And I have a story. It shows that it does increase. Month 2 now has an average over 6, almost 7. Month 3 is about 10. Month 4 is about 12. I've made a nice, pretty picture. I show an increase. I'm done. My research is correct. Everything, happy, enjoy, and all that. Except I made so many mistakes in this. And remember, I said I like bad examples and I was going to make mistakes. So I made so many in this. Let's look at what I did wrong. Avoiding these mistakes is important in doing cybersecurity well. And it's not just cybersecurity. This is actually a common problem in a lot of research, but this is a cybersecurity example. So we'll stick with that. First thing, I relied only on the average to decide that I should drop month 1 out. I said, hey, the averages are the same, I'm done. I said the average tells me everything I need to know about these distributions. The histogram shows they're very, very different distributions. To be precise, if you really were curious, I derived one from a skewed normal and the other one from the Poisson distribution. They're very, very different distributions once I plotted it out. And by saying, hey, the mean tells me everything I need to know, I'm missing a lot. I mean, look at this histogram. In month 2, I get a lot of things that have 0, but in month 1, it's only almost over 50. But in month 1, you know, the most common is 5. Don't rely on single summary statistics. A summary statistic is mean, median, mode, or standard deviation. You shouldn't rely on just one number to describe an entire distribution. They can be misleading that way. So let's go back to this. I put in the mean, median, and mode and standard deviation for both in this. And if you see, the mean and the median are exactly the same for both months. I constructed it so the mean was the same, the median being the same, just was a happy accident. The mode, though, is completely different. Mode is the most common. So the most common for month 2 was 0. The most common for month 1 was 5. That's a completely different thing telling me. The standard deviation or the spread around the mean is also different in each one. They're completely different distributions. Mistake number 2. I didn't stick with my plan. You should always stick with your plan. I said, hey, okay, I looked at the data and this didn't work, so I'm just going to drop things and change my plan completely. Always stay with your plan. If the plan doesn't work, that's another problem we'll discuss later, but never ever change your plan in the middle. I said in my plan I was going to conserve the data from each month, not that I was going to pick the months that worked the best. I should have stuck with the 4 months, and knowing that I may or may not have proven what I was after is a different thing, but I should have stuck with my plan. Mistake number 3. I just dropped some data. I said, you know, I don't like this data. I have with these IP addresses. I'm just going to drop it and it's going to be just fine, and bye-bye data. Never, ever omit data from the study unless there's a very good reason. For example, if for month 1, it had been really corrupted, or I'd lost my passive DNS data feed, or I'd lost my drive completely, which I have done in the past, that's a good reason to drop the data. But I have to document why I dropped the data and didn't follow the plan. So I would document from month 1, oops, I lost the hard drive and I was not able to collect things for 3 weeks. So I was not able to use month 1. I didn't just drop the data because I don't like the data. Other pitfalls. This is an example of going back to the visualization on domain names. Use subject matter knowledge to inform data aggregation. The visualization using TLDs is a very good example of this. Use TLDs to group things, not alphabetical. For vulnerabilities, we don't group vulnerabilities by the first letter of the description of the vulnerability, which would be very weird because I think most of them start with T, but we group them in ways that make sense for the fact that they are vulnerabilities. For malware, we tend to group them in families because that makes sense for the malware. We don't just pick random features and say, we'll group them by this. We use our subject matter knowledge. Another example pitfall is to validate results. I should have had a second set of data to go back and see if I can get the same results. These mistakes are called data dredging. They have many other forms of being called. I like data dredging. Occasionally it's called p-hacking. It is thought to be why not all research is replicable, okay? People are going back and changing their plan, they're dropping data, and then you go back and try to replicate the results or corroborate, and you can't, because in the middle, they changed horses midstream, and you should never change horses midstream. You should keep with the plan. And I made one very major mistake. I kept saying, it doesn't fit my theory, so I'm changing the situation. I kept saying, the fact that things aren't changing from month 1 to month 2 does not help my theory, so I'm just going to drop month 1. The fact those IP addresses don't fit my situation, so I'm just going to drop the IP addresses. I was married to that idea. I was married to the idea that there was something there, and I was cherry picking the data to prove the result I'd already decided was true. This happens in more than cybersecurity. It's a very big problem in math as well. Never, ever marry your ideas, okay? You can be wrong, and being wrong is okay. The important thing is to know when you're wrong. The important thing is to say, okay, if I had gone through the study originally and said, okay, this doesn't actually work, there isn't a change over the whole thing over the 4 months, that is a result to know. For example, that blacklist study I mentioned earlier, when we started it, everyone had the assumption that blacklist always agreed. There may be a little bits here and there that they didn't agree on, but for the most part that they agreed. And we came along and said, nope, they don't. And if you look at the 300 pages, and it's mostly tables, there's about 12 pages of actual writing and the rest of it's tables. We slice and dice that data every way we possibly could to see if we could prove the result that there was some agreement somewhere with the blacklists. And you know what? There was nothing there. But so never, ever marry your ideas. It's okay to be wrong. It happens. It should happen in research. It's not always being right. Which is going to take me to my next point, which is negative results are still results. Okay. This is a very big, important topic to me because first of all, you hear the phrase negative results and you hear the word negative and people are like, oh, wait, negative is bad. Okay. So they shouldn't be reported because the word negative, they're a mistake. I don't care about negative results. Negative results are not mistakes. Mistakes are what I made in that example I went through. In the bad example, I made mistake after mistake. I used aggregate statistics and I relied on them. I dropped data. I changed plans in midstream. That is called a null result. A null result is when you make the mistakes in your study. A negative result is when you do everything right and my result does not prove my hypothesis, okay? Two different things, remember that. Null results are the bad ones. Negative results are actually good things to know. For example, in COVID, if someone had come up with a vaccine and tried it out and said, hey, wait, this doesn't work, knowing that actually saves time and money for other people. They don't try to replicate your reaction. Negative results are important. So research is kind of like a maze, okay? You start at the upper corner with a theory and you try to get the bottom right with the result and you're going through the maze and everyone wants it to be a nice, pretty linear start, stop, nice straight line. Research is rarely, if ever, a straight line. There's never a start, stop, okay, A to B. Research is winding your way through the maze. And it's more about the path you took as the paths you didn't take. Why don't those corner cases work? What are the assumptions being made in those corner cases that don't apply to the real world? What can we learn from this? Okay, it's always about what can we learn. So when do you report negative results? The same time you report positive results. Negative results should not be ignored because of the word negative results. Negative results should be paid attention to always. Is the result useful? Does the result move the field of cybersecurity forward in some way? Is it novel? Is it a new thing to be known? Was the research done well, which is always important, whether it's positive result or negative result? Was the research done well? If the research was not done well, then, well, it shouldn't be reported either way. Does it challenge a commonly held assumption? This is important to me in negative results because people have their assumptions about how the world works, how cybersecurity works. They had the assumption on how blacklists work. People believed that it didn't matter what blacklist they chose to determine if their domains were wrong. If they chose a random blacklist, what my coworker and I said at the end was, no, you're not finding new things. What you just did is replicate that blacklist by proving your domains are bad. You have to know the commonly held assumptions everyone has, and you should challenge them in some fashion to say, hey, is this true? Is this not true? In math, we always start with an assumption, but we can always back up our assumption. The same thing should be true in cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is also it's never static. It is always changing. When I got in this field 30 years ago, floppies existed, right? My very, very first virus I ever had to deal with, I got on a 5¼ inch floppy, and I got it from the language lab at Auburn University. And I took it back to the language lab and said, there's a virus on this. And they were very, very confused about what I was talking about as I handed it back to them. I said, don't give this out to anyone else, get rid of it. And I think they gave it out to other people anyway, because they didn't know what I was talking about. So it is always, always changing thing. I dealt with a security incident that actually came about because someone didn't secure wireless. In this day and age, the idea of someone not securing wireless is just, it's not done. Everyone secures their wireless. So it's always changing from the beginning to end. It's never been the same. I mean, the original ransomware the original ransomware came out in floppies. Okay, and it didn't really work because floppies. For example, when I got into this business and when I first worked for a startup ISP, domain parking was this thing. And it means something different back then than it does now. Back then, you took a domain and you parked it on an IP address. And the reason you did that is because it took a long time from the time you registered a domain until it was active. These days you register a domain. I registered a domain for my niece and 10 minutes later it was live. Today, 30 years ago, it took a lot longer. For one thing, the internet was not exactly as big a pipes shooting data around as you see today. So domain parking meant something back then, and back then bad guys used it a lot. In the old days, it was used by malicious actors. It wasn't just people doing it. Malicious actors did it quite often because they'd register a whole bunch of domains all at once. They'd park them and then they'd use them as they needed them. So my coworker and I showed that currently domain parking is not a thing when the addresses are private. They're parking, private IP addresses. I looked at, and this was a brute force, no spiffy machine learning, no spiffy method at all. I brute forced this and looked at 300 million domains. And the end result was about 500 or so of those domains that used the private IP parking were considered malicious domains. I mean, that's not even a drop in the bucket. I mean, there's just so many domains out there, okay? And if you randomly chose a domain using any kind of method that said, hey, I'm going to find malicious domains that park on private IP addresses using my really spiffy method is 99% effective. What we said at the end was, yeah, you're more likely to be wrong than right. It's called the base rate fallacy, which is the smallest base rate of that stuff happening. The fact that we did this upset many people, and it was hard to publish because they expected otherwise. And our proof that their assumption was wrong bothered them. What we were saying was, hey, you know that machine learning method you're doing to find this? Don't. Find something else to look at, use it for something else, but don't do it for this because there's just nothing there to find. And it shouldn't have bothered them. It should not have bothered them at all. Science is everything. Science is positive results. Science is negative results. Science is everything, not just the results you happen to like. Doing cybersecurity well should always be your goal, okay? You should collect your data well. You should use structured observation to collect your data. You shouldn't be affecting your data as you collect it. You just imagine it dropping it into a bucket. I have buckets and buckets of data, okay? I have under 20 terabytes of data and of space in my office. I have some big buckets in my office. I like to collect data, but I try not to affect the collection. And then once I use it and I try to come up with things to show with that data, I want my results to be replicable and I want them to be repeatable and I want people to be able to corroborate them. Avoiding those pitfalls though that I mentioned, and there's a lot of pitfalls, there's a lot more than that bad example. There's a lot of fallacies. You see people who believe that since I found an anomaly in cybersecurity data, therefore I found something malicious. That's not true. That's a fallacy right there. The base rate fallacy I mentioned earlier, that's another one that should be avoided. So avoid the pitfalls in your research and you want your results to be relevant and useful. I want people to use that blacklist result. I want people to say, hey, blacklists don't agree. So if I'm finding bad things and I only use one blacklist to corroborate myself, I'm missing things and I'm not seeing everything. And the other thing that happens in the data dredging is data's weird, okay? When you collect data, data can be very weird and every person has a different view on the internet. So what I collect and the way I'm collecting things may be different from the way you collect, for example, routing data. Because there's no global snapshot of what the internet routing table looks like. Everyone has their own view of what's going on. So if I hand you my method and you're collecting, for example, routing data, you should be able to have it apply to your routing data. So I shouldn't be doing my research in such a way that I am finding those little corner cases and weirdnesses in my data. Always try to keep it as generic as possible and avoid data dredging, or also known as p-hacking, and all the phrases it's been called. And if you can, validation is important. You want your results to be used by others. We want people to actually say, hey, Lee found this blacklist result. It's important. It's been corroborated. We can use it. And thank you very much. And I have questions. Do we have any questions? Ask questions in the chart.
Thank you, Lee. Yes, there are some questions in the chat. Are you able to get them or?
I see one, does replicable require reproducible? And I usually think of them as two different things. I don't think one necessarily requires the other. And no, I have never changed a single side floppy to a double-sided one with a paper hole punch. I actually just recently found a nice box of 5.25 inch floppies and tossed them. I also found a 5.5 inch floppy drive in my pile of hardware and got rid of that too. I had no idea why I still had that.
So if audience members have any questions, please post them in the Q&A section. The chat is fine as well, but the Q&A, and that gives us an easier opportunity to monitor them.
Okay, I'm going to ask a question and see if anyone has anything to add to it. Have you seen any bad assumptions in cybersecurity that you would want to be addressed or want to know why people make these assumptions?
I see Professor Spafford is line. Are you ready for a lecture?
Actually, I think I'm talking to him about this tomorrow. Okay, from George, how would I suggest applying these principles in less academic settings? So an incident response, that's usually what I think about this. An incident response, for example, when I dealt with them, I didn't just go random around and collect data and go, I shall collect data for my incident response. I had a plan. I always started with a plan. The checklist was my plan. Checklist was a very fond plan of how to collect the data. And it's also following the checklist and collecting the data to do the checklist. But, you know, having a plan and sticking to the plan, I didn't just randomly decide, oh, I shall wander over and do this other thing rather than find the attribution. I stuck to my plan and I always planned ahead of time. And not collecting enough data is also a major problem. Yes. Cybersecurity data, for one thing, there's a ton of it. And the other thing is collecting it is also very hard. I'm actually working on a paper right now where what I needed was peak caps from malware. And I didn't just need, okay, hey, look, this piece of malware went to this C2 server and came back. I needed it, you know, actual data of what was happening, and finding that was hard. I found some, but finding the data is hard in general. And people do make, okay, I have 10 pieces of data, I've made an assumption, and I can tell you a whole story about this 10 pieces of data. I'm like, no, but thanks for trying. But this is not actually a problem in just cybersecurity. I was talking to a coworker about this who does machine learning, and she was actually explaining to me that in his, for example, studies on autism, you might have 10 participants. So you have people drawing conclusion on autism based on a study of 10 people. And you really can't say, you know, you can't do the same thing. You just can't say that about people with autism based on 10 people. People are weird.
There are two questions that are in the Q&A.
Okay, Q&A, yes. Any suggestions for cybersecurity, internet privacy researchers using for gaps in the literature? That is a very good question. So I have a very weird background in that I spent years in industry before I ended up as a researcher. And when I end up looking at things and going, hey, wait a minute, I remember doing that and it didn't work like that. One of the first things I found at CERT was actually that these domains were, these name servers were changing IP addresses very rapidly. And I can tell you as someone in industry, changing the IP address of a name server is a multi-day headache. We did it once. The second time we changed routing rather than changing the IP address of the name server. Okay, so I knew that that shouldn't be happening. So I investigated what was going on, and it turns out to be involved with pharma spam. So it's, if you start with a good basis on how things work and you just look around look at data or talk to people. I'm actually working on a process right now where I talked to a vulnerability researcher and I said, hey, how do you think vulnerabilities happen? And now I'm going to see if I can prove what he said actually is true. You talk to people, and you should be able to get my email address if you want to talk to me as well. I will be happy to answer any questions. And if I have any ideas, I'll point you to them. A lot of it's just looking at what's going on in the world. I can tell you, here's an example. We got a paper into DTRAB on Ethereum smart contracts. Finding reviewers on Ethereum smart contracts was not easy because it is so new. Not too many people had written on it. So finding people who actually had the background in order to review a paper on Ethereum smart contracts, I think I asked 30 people and all I needed were 3 reviewers. Okay, next question. PQC. Remind me what PQC is. Because I'm not sure what PQC, I don't remember that acronym, sorry. And for the minimum,
Post-quantum computing.
post-quantum, we're actually looking at doing a special issue for DTRAP on quantum computing and the digital threats of quantum and quantum crypto. So I don't know. I don't have enough background on that yet. I'll let you know after I read the DTRAP special issue. And if there's anyone interested in working on a DTRAP special issue, I'd be love to hear about it. And the minimum significant sample size, I will defer that one to statisticians because I am not a statistician. Sorry, I just write about it sometimes. And because that is one of those things where sometimes the only number of people you can get are 10. For example, with the autism study, I actually did some reading on some studies. There was one that was done essentially on, I want to say vulnerability. No, it was on, anyway, it was done essentially by finding people at Black Hat and DEF CON and interviewing them. And I think they had 20 people because that's all they could find. I've seen another one where they were looking for experts in cybersecurity in a certain field, and you had to have a certain level of knowledge. And the number of people who fit that was very small. And the number of people who would actually answer the questions, even smaller. So sometimes it's totally what you have to be able to ask. And gadgets is actually in software vulnerabilities. Gadget is a software vulnerability. There is a return condition in the code that can be hooked into to create an exploit. And determining which are actually, exploitable is one thing. Determining how exploitable is another thing. It's basically an example of why weighting everything the same is not a good idea. Any other questions?
Lee, thank you very much for being our invited speaker this week. Based on the comments, looks like very engaging with the audience here. To attendees, I want to remind you that this is session 2 of the CERIAS Summer Security Seminar Series. And that next week, Neil Gong, an assistant professor from Duke University, will giving a talk on secure federated learning. So with that, we'll adjourn for the day. And again, thanks for all who attended.
And thank you for having me. This was a lot of fun for me.
Can't wait to have you on campus live.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.